Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Hubert. Great to be here.
Great to have you. We're here to speak a little bit about you and your kind of your incredible career.
My long life.
Your long life. And very, what really strikes me is how diverse it is and how much risk you took. Maybe not like outrageous Red Bull diving off a building risk, but in terms of the types of risk you took in your life is quite incredible, and I want to speak a little bit to that in this interview, because the thing with you is that you have such a large life, larger than life, that it's a bit difficult to introduce you because you've been so many things.
I like to think I've done a lot of things in my life, and I've just realised it's interesting that I'm here as Stephen Ogden, as Stephen rather than thogdad. I mean, we'll talk more about the YouTube later, but these days it's all about my other persona, the YouTube persona. So it's great to be here as Stephen for once.
Yeah, today you're here as Stephen.
I am.
We're going to talk about Stephen. Obviously, at Fuse Capital, we do financial advisory.
Yes.
And so what we're interested in is the Stephen that worked at the Big Four and then became somebody else and then did other things and then flew to post-Soviet Russia at 25. And we want to speak a little bit about that. You qualified as a chartered accountant with KPMG.
I did. It all started in a very sort of normal 9-to-5 conventional way. I mean, I was brought up in Lancaster in Lancashire. And when I was 22, I went to Manchester, joined KPMG, Pete Marwick McClintock as it was then, and did the 3-year chartered accountancy qualification. So it was something a lot of people questioned my choice. It was seen as, I mean, certainly back in the day, there was a comedy called Monty Python, and they would mock chartered accountancy.
Of course.
And it was seen as very dull, very boring, very safe.
Yeah.
But quite honestly, it was something I did, and everything I've done since, in some way, leads back to that. It's an absolutely fantastic qualification, and I'm delighted that I did those years. I've got very happy memories of being in Manchester, being an auditor and a consultant, and learning my trade in the north of England.
So the Monty Pythons didn't have a point there.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, we all like to laugh at ourselves, but I think a lot of people, some people are put off by that stereotype.
Yeah.
And the stereotype of an accountant, of a chartered accountant, of an auditor is very, very negative. And sometimes you meet the people who meet the stereotype. But I've met some of the wackiest, most interesting, most fun people, I swear, I met at KPMG, at Price Waterhouse. Just funny. People with minds, working in very different ways. And I like to think in some ways that was encouraged. And that, I fit into that category. But certainly the reason I did that qualification, partly was pragmatic. I just knew I would learn a lot, and whatever I did later in life, it would serve me well. And it has.
So we're going to speak about that. Actually, I have a question exactly for that.
Of course.
Yeah. But what's really, because obviously I'm a bit too young to, I've known that I was born in 1999. I don't know, when was your son born?
My son was born in 2001. Yes, you're very.
We have
similar.
No idea what life was like in the Soviet era. The flash, and so we really don't really have like a good feel of how tense it was and how the wall falling, how impactful that was in terms of like feeling that things were kind of opening up. Is that the reason why you went to Moscow?
Do you know, that's very interesting. One of the main reasons that I went overseas is that between the ages of 21 and 22, I took what is now called a gap year. So I finished university in Durham, politics and economics, and the only thing I wanted to do was put on a backpack and travel around the world, which I did. And I went over to Australia and I worked in the cotton fields for a while. I worked as a warehouse man driving a forklift truck. Cool. And over 4 months, I saved up a few $1,000s and put on the backpack and traveled around Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and India, and had an amazing time and learned a lot and really developed myself as a person. And to put it into context, this was a time when there was no mobile phones, when there were no laptops, none of that sort of thing. So putting on a backpack and literally putting traveler's checks in your pocket. I didn't even have a credit card. And I spent that year going around the world. It sort of built up my independence, but also I came away thinking at some point I'm going to go to a country like Indonesia or Hong Kong and work overseas.
Right.
So I went in, I came back to Manchester age 22 for those 3 years, but I always thought as soon as I'm qualified, I'm sort of going to put on that backpack again, if you like.
Right.
So Moscow was not my first choice. And you raise an interesting point, because at that time, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Berlin Wall had been torn down. And it's almost impossible for someone your age to realize the world we lived in the 70s and 80s, when on a daily basis as children, we thought there might be the mushroom cloud. Yeah. We thought there might be a nuclear war. We were told what to do.
Actually, in the last 2 years, we're kind of feeling that tension a little bit again. That's kind of interesting, but let's not talk necessarily about that.
Yes, but it was very different. You were either the West or you were the Soviet bloc. And suddenly, between 89 and 91, really, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and then along came Yeltsin and then Gorbachev, and the Soviet Union collapsed. Yeah. And that was unthinkable beforehand. In the 70s and most of the 80s, it was unthinkable that would happen. Yeah. So suddenly I'm in a position, and what happened, it's very interesting how it happened. I'm 25 years old, I'm in Manchester, I'm applying for jobs with KPMG in Singapore and Hong Kong, and a fax was sent round. You might even not know what a fax is. A piece of paper came through the fax machine from the Moscow office, and this is 1993, saying we desperately need staff in Moscow to do all the work that we're getting. We can't handle the work. Who wants to do it? Now, my senior manager at the time, Jonathan, came over to my desk and he said, "Oggers, do you fancy going to work in Moscow?" And I thought he was joking, and I sort of laughed and said, "Oh, that would be great." Then I went on a 5-week trip to Israel and Palestine and Jordan and Egypt, backpacking trip. And I came back and people were congratulating me. They were saying, "Oggers, I hear you're going out to work in Moscow." And my sort of putting up my hand and saying, "That sounds like a laugh," was translated into, "Yes, we have someone who wants to come and work in Moscow." Yeah. And it felt almost like there was some sort of cosmic, invisible force pulling me into this job. I had absolutely no desire really to go and work in Russia. More important than that, my first thought was, why? What sort of work could there be in Moscow, in Russia, in 1993? Who could afford to pay for accountants, auditors, consultants? Yeah. So I went out there thinking, this could be an adventure. It's kind of fallen into my lap. This is fate. I'm young, I'm adventurous, and what could possibly go wrong? And that's what drove me out there. I didn't really know what I was getting into.
You know what? It sounds, do you remember Seinfeld probably better than I do?
Yes, I love Seinfeld.
What the story you described sounds like something that would happen in Seinfeld. Like, George, that'd be a laugh. And then in the end, they actually give him the job and he goes to Moscow. So you feel like there was a little bit of a fate thing going on,
Well, yes. I mean, certainly what I've taught my kids over the years is sometimes something falls in your lap or you get offered an opportunity. And often the best and most interesting thing is to say, yes, let's try that. Yeah. And that was one of these things. It was a case of, I could wait a year and go over to Hong Kong and Singapore and work in banking audits and what have you. Or next month, I could go out to Russia. And the funny thing then what happened is that a few weeks later, there was this terrible event happening. The storming of the White House in Moscow happened in October 93. And I was due to go out at the end of October 93. And people were coming up to me saying, "What a shame, Oggers, that you won't be going to Moscow." And I just thought, well, I'm going. So I went out to a country, and ironically, I rented an apartment near the burnt out White House building. So I saw the renovation of this Parliament building over the first few weeks of me being in Russia. And that was like a metaphor for everything I'd let myself in for. But it turned out to be an incredible decision. The first thing that happened, I went out with no contract, no agreement over salary. I was, I think, the 29th person to work for KPMG Moscow, and that includes drivers, secretaries, what have you. So I was one of the first competent people to arrive.
Accountants. I'm sure the drivers were competent.
No, sorry, it's a joke. So I was, one of the first people to arrive at this office, and fast forward 15 years, and there would be thousands. There'd be 2,000 or 3,000 people working for, let's say, KPMG in Moscow.
Pioneering a little bit, yeah.
Absolutely pioneering. So I went into a completely disorganized environment. So I'd gone from KPMG Manchester, which was a brilliant office, a very professional, wonderful group of partners and staff, with systems and controls, and you did things in a certain way. And suddenly I land in this Moscow office where everything is wrong. There's no proper management, no proper organization. There are so many clients almost from day one. You're given a staff of unqualified Russians, and unqualified because how could they have learned anything about audit, consulting?
It's a different planet.
They had been brought up in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're told, you're working for this global accounting company. And they were thinking, Stephen, can you tell us what to do? Because we don't know. We haven't been trained. Meanwhile, there were very big clients in banking, oil and gas, metals, who needed audits, who needed maybe financial statements prepared according to international standards, because they wanted to go out and raise billions of dollars on sort of global markets. So we had all this work thrown at us, disorganized office, a lack of staff, a lack of trained staff. And it was a case of just literally working. There was one week where I billed best part of 100 hours. Yeah. Now that's illegal these days.
Yeah, but that's what I'm looking at the top of your head. You don't even have so many white hairs. I would have grown a full head of white hairs with that much work. That's incredible.
It was incredible time. It was stressful, but you just worked on adrenaline. Yeah. And there were times, and really, we didn't have enough staff. Like I said, you'd get back from Kazakhstan on an audit, and you'd be told, right, tomorrow you're going to Estonia, you're going to Tallinn. And then and then the following week you'd be in Uzbekistan where the temperature was plus 42, but a few months later you'd be in Siberia doing an oil and gas audit where it's minus 42, and literally that happened. So the sort of diversity of the former Soviet Union was astonishing, and it was just a case of you learned as you went, and things like along the way. I mean, I turned up with not a word of Russian.
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Yes, I mean, the staff all spoke English to some degree. So English was the business language. Yeah. But of course, to get around, for taxis in shops and what have you, you had to learn some Russian. And it's little challenges like that. Yeah. Also at the time, back in 1993, there were no proper shops in Moscow. It sounds bizarre that.
It does.
Because in the Soviet times, you didn't need to market. You didn't need to sell.
Yeah.
A shop, there would be no store frontage trying to draw you into the shop.
You sign up for bread and 3 weeks later you get bread.
You were lucky. You were if you got to consume a good or bread or meat or something, you were the lucky one.
Yeah.
And the shop assistants were rude and obstructive.
Of course, yeah.
It was a very different environment to the likes of the UK.
Yeah. That's very interesting. That's very, very interesting. I actually have way too many questions that popped up one after the other. I have trouble picking one. I feel I don't really want to get too off track, but it's true that if you don't have marketplace, competition, branding, you don't have accountability.
Yes.
And they didn't have that concept yet, I guess, because they had no accountability with the branding.
Everyone was learning, and if you now look at that, if you look at those years, it's an incredible time in history.
Yeah.
Those years from, let's say, 89, certainly through the 90s, in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, in the wider Eastern Europe, you're changing from one system to another, a system where socialism, where the state rules your life and tells you where to work, what to do, where to shop. Suddenly, you've got capitalism. And nobody, particularly the older population, was not ready for it. And in Russia at the time, there was real poverty. I think Russia in those years was very close to starvation. I think at times, because what you had, the state had run out of money. Yeah. So teachers, lecturers, nurses, doctors, anyone who worked for the state, which was everyone really, if you think about it, because in socialism, everyone worked for the state. Yeah. Factories and schools and hospitals stopped paying wages because they couldn't pay the wages. So you had old people on the streets of Moscow begging for bread, and you could tell by looking at them they were undernourished. Mm-hmm. There were people who were probably, like I said, weeks away from starvation. That's how bad things were at that time. You go to Moscow now, it's really difficult right now. Let's say go to Moscow 2 or 3 years ago and you see a wonderful, rich international city. Yeah. But in 93, it was very, very different.
That's so interesting.
And so looking back, I wish I'd gone around with a camera. Yeah. And photographed everything that I saw. But certainly the fall of the Berlin Wall, what I should have done, age 21, actually I was the other side of the world, I should have got on a train and gone over there and witnessed it. Yeah. Because that moment will be written about for centuries. And certainly Russia in the 90s, there were incredible challenges. And for many, many people, it was very, very hard. I would describe Russia in 93 as it was 150 million population, of which maybe 10,000 were super rich, maybe 100,000 were middle class, and everyone else was poor. Yeah. So over the 90s, the year 2000, over the next 30 years, you had the development of a middle class. Yeah. Yeah. You had people setting up companies. You had businesses changing from former Soviet entities into modern, efficient businesses. The transition was astonishing. And the role that the likes of KPMG and Price Waterhouse took was helping that transition. Yeah. So like I said, you had a company, maybe a Russian bank, who wanted to be respected who wanted to deal with the West. Let's call it the West. So they have to have audited IFRS accounts. We called it IAS at the time, international accounting standards. They needed a different sort of set of accounts. They needed them audited. They needed consulting projects done. They might need information memoranda. They might need documentation associated with raising debt and raising equity. And that was our role. And there weren't enough hours in the day for people like me. The work was just being thrown at us. And every month I'd be at a client, I'd be offered a job. In my mid-20s, I'd be offered CFO roles. I'd be offered roles that really,
that's a great segue.
I was 5 to 10 years away from being qualified for.